The problem with what I'm going to call traditional AI is you really have to have a very clear idea of what problem you're trying to solve. And you have to have the gigabytes of data and the 10 PhD data scientists and the budget to train the models. The juice is often not worth the squeeze because the model you're creating is very specific to that particular problem. So the model you create, for example, for recognizing numbers is not going to recognize letters automatically.
Welcome to Work Matters, where we explore what leaders can do to make work more productive, valuable, meaningful, and impactful. I'm your host, Thomas Bertels. In today's episode, I'm talking with Andrew Patricio, Chief Data and AI Officer at UNIDOS US, the largest Latino civil rights and advocacy organization in the United States. Besides walking us through how UNIDOS US approached AI, Andrew also offers his perspectives on the risks and opportunities associated with AI. I've known Andrew for many years and very much appreciate his insights. As always, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Here's my conversation with Andrew Patricio. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to have this conversation.
Yeah, same here. Why don't you give a short introduction of who you are, the kind of work you do?
My official title is Principal for Digital Services for UNIDOS US, the largest Hispanic advocacy and civil rights organization in the U.S. So been around for about, I think now 55 years or so, a little bit more than that. My role is very interesting. It was created back in 2021 when I started, so I'm the first person in this role. And initially, it was focused on technology in general. The idea is that we had a IT team that did our infrastructure in terms of user support and networking and all that kind of thing. But they want somebody who's going to focus on technology to use more directly in our work to make it more effective. And so when I started here, it was immediately clear that data was our biggest gap and biggest opportunity. We were just a sea of Excel. Data was very much kind of an afterthought. It was almost like an administrative overhead. The idea was that let's do all of our planning, let's do all of our budgeting and all that. And it's okay, now we're done that. Now, what are we going to do with data? What are we going to capture? And it was very tactical and very transactional. It was very tactical in the sense that we gathered the data based on a funder request or a regulatory requirement or things like that. So it was very reactive to what we just had to do from an MOU perspective and not necessarily what's useful for us. And it was transactional because we work with a lot of affiliates. We don't actually work directly in the community. We work through local affiliates or independent nonprofits that we partner with on a particular project. And so all of our data comes from them. And they send us the data, they toss it over the wall, we give them the sub-grant, and everyone moves on with their lives, right? There's no use of data. The phrase I came up with was that we were pretty much decision-driven data gathering instead of data-driven decision-making, right? So over the last 3 years, transformed ourselves to be a little bit more of a truly data-driven organization. And in a way, starting from such a frankly primitive starting point was good because there wasn't a lot to clean up. I just had to just build from scratch. And so that made me be able to build in a way that was thoughtful for the future, that met people where they were and then kind of scaffolded us up to where we needed to be from a pure data perspective. And so up till about last year, that was pretty foundational. It was replacing Excel with operational data systems. It was building out a data warehouse, pretty standard data analytics kind of stuff. Last year, what I did with my team is I told them, look, do the Google thing. Take 10% of your time and just go figure some stuff out that's somewhat germane to our work, but maybe not directly driven by a specific problem. And so one of my data engineer went and just dove into AI. And then he just started talking about it all the time. And I'm just like, all right, you're only allowed to say AI twice a day, right? Everything was AI. But then we had a demo by Amazon Web Services on their AWS Bedrock product last fall, and that just blew our minds. And so we've been just really accelerating since then, building a lot of proofs of concept and some production systems and things like that. But it's really generative AI, I think, the hype is real, right? It's something that is going to be truly transformative. And hopefully the democratization of AI, though, there are definitely pros and cons, and it could go both ways. So that's what we're really trying to drive, is more towards the positive side of that.
So you've been deploying AI now for a year. So I'd be curious to hear how you approached it.
Yep.
And also what benefits you've seen at this stage.
Yeah. So I think what we need to take a step back, because I think now that AI is so ubiquitous, everyone thinks they know what it is. And I think it's instructive to say what it is and what it isn't. So AI, in a generic sense, is just a model. You use the models all the time. Like the example I give when I'm driving my motorcycle down the street and I'm looking to predict what cars are going to do in front of me, I'm modeling what's going to happen. I'm saying, okay, that car is coming over to my lane. That guy doesn't have his turn signal on, but he's looking to the left. So I'm keeping aware of what's going to happen, right? AI is just that. It's just a model to predict something. The difference is how you construct that model. So my experience in training to a certain extent gives me the model I use when I'm driving on the road. But with AI, the model is all this data that you feed it, all the machine learning, right? You basically are feeding in data into this network and it's making a prediction. And then you're looking at the prediction compared to what the reality is and then adjusting the weights inside it. That's all it's doing. At the end of the day, it's a gigantic linear equation. But the problem with what I'm going to call traditional AI is you really have to have a very clear idea of what problem you're trying to solve. And you have to have the gigabytes of data and the 10 PhD data scientists and the budget to train the models. The juice is often not worth the squeeze because the model you're creating is very specific to that particular problem. So the model you create, for example, for recognizing numbers is not going to recognize letters automatically. The model you create for driving a Tesla down the road is probably not going to necessarily work for driving a bus down the road. It's very particular to that use case. Generative AI is a little bit different. At the end of the day, it's still a model. At the end of the day, it's still for a very specific narrow use case. But that narrow use case is almost infinitely flexible because that narrow use case, the thing it's predicting is what's the next word? Simple as that, right? Saying given all these words, what is probably the next one? And so when you put in a prompt, that's why they call it a prompt, right? It's not a query, it's not a request, it's a prompt. It's saying, okay, start from these words I typed in and now start generating the next word. Then take the next word you generated and that prompt and generate the next one. And it just feeds back again and again and generates that next word. That's a fairly seemingly simple use case, but because it's generating language at the end of the day, because the statistical model is using is that of language, you really have this blossoming of potentials there. And I think the real revolutionary thing, as opposed to evolutionary thing, is the fact that when you need to use traditional AI, right? Like we even tried it about 2 years ago before this Gen AI revolution. We tried to train an AI model on some text we were doing, and we were getting nowhere because again, we didn't have a very well-defined problem. We didn't have a lot of resources. We didn't have a lot of data even. But with generative AI, you don't have to create the model. The work with traditional AI is in creating the model, right? Defining the problem, creating the model, all that. The work at generative AI is the use case because someone's already created that model. Like when we're using Claude or Titan or OpenAI or whatever LLM you're talking about, you're just running the model. You don't have to spend all that time and energy and effort and money to decide what those weights are. You're just taking all those weights in that massive neural network and now just running it. Technically speaking, you could run an LLM on your laptop. It's going to be a little slow, but not crazy, right? There's no way you could do any kind of training on your laptop with traditional AI kind of approaches. And so that I think is the real realization that with generative AI, it is democratization of AI. It's really started to make it relevant to your everyday life. My mom has used ChatGPT. She's amazed and a little bit freaked out by it, but at the end of the day, my mom is not going to train some model to recognize numbers or letters, but she's going to use the model that OpenAI and Meta and all those guys have created. And so all this leads to how we're using it. So the analogy I give is the Supreme Court, right? You have the justices, and then you have their clerks, right, that assist the justices. When that justice, those clerks can't replace the justice. They can't do the job of the justice. But the justice is doing their job a lot better because of the clerks. They'll say, okay, here's the overall thrust of my argument. Go find some precedents to support this part. This other part here is maybe a little shaky. Let's try to clean that up a little bit. It's a conversation back and forth between the clerks and the justice, refining that argument, and both are contributing to it. At the end of the day, though, the justice is driving that conversation. That's essentially what Gen AI is doing. Gen AI, when you're talking with it, when you're prompting it, it's looking through its corpus of information, statistical information about language, and generating a response. You're having a conversation with it. You're saying, okay, take this part and change it. At the end of the day, you're using that tool to help you with a specific task. And I think that's where the real benefits come in, the real revolutionary part of it comes in. Because now, before, we don't all have the wherewithal or the resource or whatever to have a set of clerks to go look that stuff up for us. But now we will. I have 4 kids. The youngest is 4 years old. And I can definitely imagine that by the time she's in high school, she'll have this sort of AI, not a tutor, but this AI companion almost that helps her with her learning journey. It does something in between like a tutor and like a personalized learning kind of thing. But the idea is that's going to be the way you're going to be interacting with the world, to the point where we talk about numeracy, we talk about literacy. I think there's going to be an AI literacy thing too, where you just have to know how to interact with this thing as just a part of being a professional in the working world.
Anybody who ever played with it walks away amazed. because you type in 7 words and you get a decent sized novel at the end of it. But there's obviously also a lot of concern about it. There are all these
100%.
ethical topics that come up. And I think specifically in organizations, there's security issues. So I guess on your AI journey, I would imagine what you haven't done is just said to everybody, hey, here's a ChatGPT license, right? Go forth and multiply. So how have you actually addressed those concerns about security and bias in your work?
I think there's three main dangers with generative AI. There's the fact that because generative AI is frankly so easy to implement, because my mom can use it, right? There's this danger in your population, in your staff, in your user base of thinking, oh yeah, we've solved AI. It's done. There's C3PO or there's Skynet, right? Good and bad. And it's not. Generative AI, in a way, the generative part is a little bit misleading because it's synthesis. It's taking information it has and synthesizing that in a different way based on your prompt. It's not necessarily driving anything. It's not creating anything anew. And so I think there's this danger of saying, oh, yeah, I hear the word Gen AI. I know it stands for generative AI, but I'm really thinking in the back of my head, general AI. I think I can use this for anything. And that's the sneaky thing because it is designed to give you a plausible sounding answer. Like, what's the probability of the next word, right? What's the reasonable next word you're expecting? It'll give you an answer to anything. You can tell it, hey, look at this job description, look at this resume, and is this a good fit? And it will tell you and give you some reasonable reasons as to why it thinks, quote unquote, it's a good fit. But it's not. It's literally telling you what it thinks you want to hear. And so someone did that. They did, I remember it was a company or just an experiment, but they did something where they took a bunch of resumes and some job descriptions and did exactly that. And as it turns out, whenever there was an Asian female name on the resume, it rated that as a better fit. When there was an African American male name, it rated it as a lower fit. Resume being exactly the same otherwise, right? And so to your point, bias has always been an issue with AI, right? Because you're training it with data sets that already exist with an inbuilt bias, right? And I think it's important to not talk about bias in the standpoint of empathy or fairness or things like that. That's important, and that's clearly our view of it. But even from just a cold-hearted financial health of your firm kind of view of it, bias is not seeing reality, right? It's a misleading view of reality. So when you have a biased data set, you're not seeing reality for where it is, and that's going to hide some potential opportunities from you. The way we're addressing that, there's the issue of bias. Another word we use with generative AI is hallucination, right? Where it's making something up that sounds plausible. There's the issue of visibility. You mentioned, hey, go ChatGPT and you go forth and multiply. What is our staff even using it for? And there's the issue of privacy, security. We've all heard these horror stories of people submitting to ChatGPT some internal sensitive document to summarize, and now that becomes part of its corpus of data that everybody has access to now. So the way we address that is there's a technique called retrieval automated generation, which is in my opinion, unnecessarily fancy word. So the idea is with a bare LLM, you type in your prompt, it generates this response strictly based on the language statistics, and that's it. And that's why it makes stuff up that sounds plausible. With this RAG approach, what you do is you type in your prompt, and the first thing it does is searches the database that you have loaded with documents that you believe is like a good relevant set of documents. They're correct, they're relevant, we've looked at them. It's a set of data that we're like, okay, we trust this data essentially. And then the system will go through and find some relevant excerpts from those documents, take those document excerpts and your prompt, and then put all of that to the LLM, at the same time telling it, only take your response from these excerpts. So rather than making something up, if it can't find something in that excerpt, it'll say, oh, I can't find something, I can't give you a good response. And so that is not perfect, but it radically reduces the bias because the idea is that you have looked at these documents. That's what we've done. We took all of our policy documents that are on our website, white papers, annual reports, press releases, all that kind of stuff, loaded it into a database. You type in a prompt, it finds the relevant documents and then creates a response. And you'll see if you type in the same prompt into ChatGPT, just bare ChatGPT, and then our tool will give a lot more relevant data. It'll say in ChatGPT, it'll talk about Latinos in the U.S. In our tool, it'll say 2 million Latinos in the U.S. They'll give percentages and numbers and things like that. And again, it's not thinking about that. It's simply just drawing relevant information from those documents. But because now you've limited to only pulling out those information from the documents, you radically reduce the level of bias you have in there. Look at the Supreme Court analogy. Instead of telling the clerk, hey, tell me about this without actually looking anything up, you're saying, hey, go look this up first and then summarize what you found and bring it back to me. So that's really the hallucination bias part of it. The second part of it is the visibility, right? Which I think is super important right now when everyone's experimenting. And so with that, with the same tool, we have people log into the system. We save every prompt and every response, right? Not from like we're going to get you Big Brother standpoint, but from a standpoint of statistically looking at what our staff is working on. So you enter the tool, first thing it does is say, what are you using this for? It's self-reported, but at least you get an idea of, am I using this for generating some remarks, for doing a tweet, for doing a proposal, whatever it might be, right? Then when when you're typing in the prompts, we save every prompt and every user so we can do a report at the end of the day saying, oh, it looks like the education team is using this mostly for generating proposals. Marketing team is using this for generating tweets. The point being is that now we have a lot more visibility into what our team is doing. And again, from an education standpoint, not from a Big Brother standpoint. In fact, when we deployed the tool, what we tell our team is, look, everybody is trying to figure out generative AI right now, right? There are truly no experts. There are people who really understand the technology, how to tune the models, all that, but even they are surprised at what the models are capable of. So we should approach it as a process of discovery. So my team is not a technical team creating a tool for you as a user to use. We instead are fellow researchers. So when you type in a prompt and it finds relevant documents and it creates some response, we tell people, and we even have a little checkbox there, did you review every one of those excerpts and make sure that all the references in the response are accurate? That's not putting like a number from one document and a phrase from another document and like glomming those together erroneously. So taking that viewpoint of discovery and, again, I think users sometimes feel like technology is happening to them. In this case, we're very much saying you are part of us finding out about how to use this technology, both internally for how we can make our work better, but then also for our community as well. So we can advise and say, this is what you should use it for, this is what you shouldn't use it for.
Now, obviously, that addresses the concerns around privacy and bias and
Right.
visibility. But there's also then the question, how does the introduction of regenerative AI change how people work?
Yeah, I think there's this sort of journey of discovery that everybody goes on. The first thing is, what is this thing? I don't trust this. I don't know. I'm old school, right? You hear that all the time. And they start using it and they're like, oh my God, this is amazing. And then they go into that, we have solved AI. This is not a thing. This is not a model. This is a person at the end of the day. They start thinking like as if it's like an intelligent thing. And again, the words we use, artificial intelligence. I find myself when I'm typing in a ChatGPT, I say, "Can you please blah blah blah," right? I'm talking to a sentient entity, right? Even though I know it's just a gigantic linear equation, right? That thing doesn't have any self-awareness at all. And so I think that's the danger. That's what happens is like people start using it and they're the initial trepidatious, but then they accelerate up this, oh, it can do anything, and they start overusing it and they start using it for everything. I'm just going to stick it in ChatGPT and generate and just paste in an email. I'm not even going to look at it. We're in the FOMO stage, right? Fear of missing out. When people are at an organizational level, much less at an individual level, organizations are feeling, oh, this Gen AI thing, it is happening. We got to get on that thing. Let's just throw some stuff together and hope for the best. And I think that we really need to take a step back and realize that, number one, with UNIDOS, for example, this tool we built is strictly internal right now. And people are talking about, hey, can we make this available for the community? I'm like, yeah, eventually, but not anytime soon. Because we really got to understand, again, taking this research aspect. We have this alien creature just dropped in the middle of our world. I am not going to expose that alien, no matter what lovely things it says right now, to our community without any kind of experiments as to what it can do, what it can't do. I'm not even going to tell the partner organizations that we work with, these affiliates, about 300 affiliates that work with us. They ask us all the time, like, how, just Gen AI, what can we do with it? And I'm like, yeah, we're figuring it out. And so I think it's important to slow your roll a little bit and take a very deliberate experimentation, iterative kind of approach, right? Start with small use cases that are strictly internal so you can get used to even how the technology works, right? So our stack that we use right now, we're just doing it over and over again for different use cases, but it's the same basic technical stack. And so now we focus on the stuff we load into it. So what kind of documents do we load into it? Because we could load everything in under the sun, but then the danger with that then is that when you do this retrieval automated generation, it finds relevant documents. Maybe you got 10 relevant documents that are all saying the same thing. And so now you've lost that richness of the response. So you really got to think about when you're working with these things, what use case are you actually using it for? What training, talk about AI literacy, what training you give your users to say, you should use it for this, don't ever use it for that. And we're discovering all that, right? And I think at the end of the day, the empowerment thing, people talk about technology empowering people all the time. It's one of the few times where it's actually true. But when I'm empowering my kids to do something, I'm not saying, hey, there's the car, let me know how that works out. You start with something small and you scaffold your way up. You're not preventing your kids or your staff from engaging with the tool, but you're doing it in a very kind of like deliberate, defined way and getting feedback. That's, I think, the important thing. When our staff is working with this tool, we tell them, we ask them specifically, How is this working? What's working? What's not working? There's different LLMs out there. Some are good for some things, some are good for other things. The world is in a process of discovery right now with Gen AI. And it's important to not over accelerate that to the point where you're like, oh, yeah, this is good. It's like you're always needing to review it and getting feedback and figuring out how best to use it.
What I hear is it's important to apply some criteria to this and evaluate what you're doing as you go through this journey.
Mm-hmm.
Because I could also see that there's like a different path that says, let's just try something, and if it's better, do more of that. But what I
Yeah.
hear you say a little bit is, yeah, that's true, but at the same time, you also got to keep an eye around, do people actually, for example, check their sources?
Yeah.
Do people use these tools for appropriate use cases? So it is like this right crawl, walk, run type model. How do people react to that though? You mentioned initially like a lot of people are excited, right? Oh my
Mm-hmm.
God, this can do so much. I would imagine probably at some point also a little bit the fear comes in, right? What's my role in this? Am I going to get replaced? Has that
Yeah.
come up at
Yeah.
Unidos?
Absolutely, it has. Absolutely. And I think it's a legitimate fear. We're heading into a very much like an inflection point in terms of AI. And people talk about that. They talk about it becoming sentient and like Skynet and taking over. And I think there's a different inflection point now, right? There's the ubiquity inflection point that we're heading into, where it's going to be just so a part of the way you interact with things. Here's one thing I was thinking about recently, right? We send emails right now, and we send an email, and there may be some back and forth thing. I can see not in the next 10 years, maybe in the next 10 years, but definitely in the next 20 years or so, that the way we communicate is potentially we don't just simply just send like an old school email, which is just blank, there's this text, it just sits there statically, but we send an avatar. That's we sort of preload maybe. We have a conversation with this thing, and we talk about this the situation that I'm talking about. Let's send it out to go talk to my client, my boss, my colleague, whatever, and then they have a kind of a conversation with back and forth. And at some point, the avatar has some built-in thing inside it that says, "Oh, okay, at this point now, I need to go ask the boss." Right? Just in the same way that the Industrial Revolution, and I hear myself saying this, and I'm the biggest technical skeptic in the world. I drive a 1983 Mercedes diesel because I do not trust technology. But even me, I see generative AI at the very least as the internet in 1990, but potentially even electricity. Because what I described, like this way of automating information, right? Automating communication, automating interaction, I can see that being an advantage when I build something, like build some furniture or whatever, right? I very rarely am sawing with a handsaw, and I'm never drilling with a hand drill. I'm barely even using a screwdriver. I'm using some power tool that gets me there faster. And there's a certain craftsman aspect of using hand tools and all that, and I appreciate that. For that expert, sure, use the hand tools because you have developed 20 years of experience, right? But now, me as some schmuck, I can go to Home Depot and buy a power tool, and without 20 years of experience, I can cut a straight line. And so now, the limitation for me is not the mechanics of putting something together, but it's my imagination of imagining a piece of furniture. And so now take that same analogy and move it to the information space. Let's say you have an immigration attorney. She's meeting with 30 different clients. She meets with one client and she's, okay, let me remind you, let me look at my notes. Okay, who are you again? Okay, I think I got it. Okay, I think this is what we need to do. But now imagine if that immigration attorney, if each one of those clients had their own paralegal AI, right? Not replacing the attorney. It's not doing the argument for them, but it's working with the attorney to make that client, who oftentimes is maybe indigent or not as informed, it's helping them to interact with the lawyer in a more effective way, to be a more informed consumer of professional services. Now, every one of their clients has this assistant that's helping them do that, engage with that professional service a little bit better. And you can see that being true in medicine and accounting. But now, if you have this kind of AI that's helping to automate the understanding part of it, is meeting people where they are. It's because you can talk to an LLM and say, take this complex document and translate it down to more simplified language for, let's say, a fifth grade level of education, and it'll do that. And you can see that it like how it's doing that, and it's doing it in an effective kind of way. And so I think that kind of automation and that kind of ability now to free people from necessarily having the experience of having the sophisticated language, I think that's where disadvantaged communities like the ones we work with, you can leapfrog. In Kenya, they went from cash payments directly to mobile payments. They skipped over credit cards. They were able to make a leapfrog and get an advantage because the credit cards, the infrastructure, have been too much, right? But now they're doing mobile payments. That's the same thing with generative AI. Imagine, for example, some kid, and maybe his parents, maybe they never completed high school, and he has an idea for an app. Right now, that kid would have to look at YouTube. I mean, there's resources now. Before, there was nothing that kid could do. He was just stuck. But at least now they can go on YouTube, Coursera, all these different things to learn some stuff. But it's still their own wherewithal to learn how the language, literally that's called programming language, of how to code, right? But now imagine he's like talking to a coding AI. This is my idea. I want to do this and this, and the AI can generate the code. Like you can already do that. Professional developers and programmers now are using ChatGPT, where in the past we'd use Google. If it wasn't for Google, coding would halt because when we're coding something, we're never writing it from scratch. We're starting with something we find on Google and messing with it. But now you're taking that a step further, and now somebody who doesn't even have the experience of coding or technology or whatever has just an idea, and the AI can start to map that to the actual code and write it for them. And again, not to that point where it's maybe like a polished thing, but at least to the point where it's a prototype and something they can kind of mess with. And again, you're scaffolding people up, and the AI has the ability now to reach down and pull you up a little bit more in an automated way. Oftentimes, when you're engaging with professionals before that, you have to be sophisticated enough to know how to ask the right questions, even. And so I think now with generative AI, that helps to like bridge that gap a little bit more.
Two follow-up questions. One is, this obviously cuts both ways. So let's take your example with the avatar. And I think I saw this piece in the New York Times over the weekend that they're now dating avatars, right? So you can send your avatar out on a website and reach out on your behalf. And I can see that's really efficient, right? Because these can be tailored responses to that profile, similar to like how people apply to a job.
Yep.
But then you can also look at that on the other end, and on the receiving end, maybe there's also an AI that filters for that.
100%.
Right? And so it just feels like it just adds like another layer, right, on top that necessarily doesn't add a lot of value, because those bots both tell each other what the other person wants to hear. So I think that's probably one of the risks, that actually as you add AI on both sides of the equation, all it does is really just raises the bar, right?
Yep.
But I think the second issue that I see, which I think is much more prevalent, is that the argument is that we're going to make work more creative because we're taking all the drudgery out. People don't have to write 4 hours of a login procedure. They just might describe what they want. The ChatGPT generates it. That's wonderful. But I guess people in generally don't design their own jobs. So all of a sudden, the 30% of work that's drudgery is gone. You need to have an organizational perspective around what are we going to do with the people that are left. And I'm just curious, has that problem come up in your work, and how do people tackle that?
Yeah, I don't think it's come up in the sense of we've encountered that specific issue in the real world just yet, but absolutely that's something on people's minds. One way I talk about this is, imagine a world where everybody has this generative AI assistant and helps them to do things and empowers them to be their creative selves, and like you said, take the drudgery and the tedium out of their day-to-day work. But now imagine a world where the balkanization is complete and everybody has like an individual little echo chamber. It's not even an echo chamber of your group, it's an echo chamber of yourself, right? That's feeding you stuff you already believe in, just really solidifying the beliefs you have that are both crazy as well as valid, right? So you never see any other dissenting opinions because the AI is always telling you exactly what you want to hear. That's not a continuum. Those are not ends of a spectrum. That's an axis. Those are two axes. And so we can be located somewhere on those. We can be simultaneously on the worst part of that and the best part of that, of either of those axes, right? And so I think that's the way to think about it. I think we need to, the empowerment that needs to happen is in just taking a step back and really fundamentally realizing that the nature of the way people are going to interact with each other is going to change. I like to think it's not a window of opportunity. I think it is a bit of a window of opportunity, but maybe not quite as stark as that. Meaning, I don't think it's like we have the next 2 years to figure this out. Otherwise, everything is going to be completely solidified. And that might be my optimistic self talking more than reality, to be honest. For sure, there's that danger, right? I think there's already with social networks and all that, we've seen that, where we've seen on the right and on the left, people are just seeing it by definition, the network is giving you stuff that you're going to click on more, which is stuff that that makes you feel more comfortable, which is stuff that validates what you already believe. So now we're always doing this. We're always having a belief and then using that to evaluate facts, right? Backwards. We thought we were looking at the fact and coming to a conclusion, but we don't. We have a belief, and if that fact matches that belief, we feel comfortable. And we're like, all right, that must be true. If a fact challenges that belief, it makes us uncomfortable, and we want to not be uncomfortable, so we don't believe that fact, right? Now, we're going to have AI that is not only starting with a fact, but it's generating something, and it's like, oh, okay, they clicked on this more. Let me give them more of this stuff that sounds plausible again, but it's completely made up. So it's automating BS.
It is going to have a very profound impact on work. At the very least, it has the potential to eliminate an awful lot of work that's repetitive, that could be easily automated, where until now we couldn't quite get there. RPA was
Yep.
just too complicated. Now this makes it more consumer friendly. So now everybody can do that. So it's going to take away that work. It also has the opportunity to potentially enhance the work that people do. But I feel, in generally, I think our tendency in organization tends to be first to reduce cost, right, rather than adding value, right? So we have a bias towards that. And then the second piece is, it's not clear to me who's going to really step in and say, I'm going to look at this from a humanistic perspective, the long-term cost of that, because it's not in the interest necessarily of the owners in the short run. It's in the interest of the employees, but they oftentimes don't have agency or don't have a word in this. So I'm wondering, this perspective is not going to magically evolve. It's going to require a conscious act, same as right technology is being consciously designed. I'm wondering who's going to take the design responsibility to make sure that this ends up as something positive for the people involved.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question. And I think my answer is, I'll say it's going to sound a little utopian and a little bit like butterflies and rainbows, right? And not the hard reality that we live in. So what I said about bias originally, right? I said that bias is not about being nice to people. It's not about kindness and fairness even, right? At the end of the day, bias is about seeing reality for the way it is. When I'm evaluating some job prospect or whatever, and I'm using my own biases in terms of might be racial or gender or even education or class or whatever. The reason why I'm doing that is because I'm familiar with those things and I'm saying that based on my familiarity, this is what I trust. Trust at the end of the day is an emotional thing. But if you can push your way through that, I think what you'll find is a lot of surprising benefits. We're a Hispanic organization, right? There's a lot of Hispanics in the US that have a lot of buying power. And so when you address those Hispanics as a market that's not in a pandering kind of, oh, let's be nice to the brown people kind of way, there's value in that for a business. Walmart, I think, is the best example. So Walmart, right? The way they became big was not by competing with the grocery stores or the department stores. What they did is said, there's these rural areas that are underserved. Let me focus there. And I'm not saying there was an unalloyed good because a lot of times they destroyed like the local businesses. But at least in terms from a business standpoint, they focused on these underserved markets that people were like, there's no money there. I'm not going to even bother with that. I'm going to focus in the suburbs and the cities where everybody is. Obviously, why would I go where there's nobody there? But they found that market because Sam Walton had the vision to sort of, I don't know what his background was, but he didn't have those same biases or he overcome those biases. We can do more working together than we can working against each other. And I think when businesses start realizing that and very cold-hearted capitalists start looking at that and saying, hey, hang on a second, there's a way to actually make more profit as well as people making people happy, right? I think there's this false choice now between I keep my employees happy or I can make some money myself. It's a very tactical kind of like simplistic way of looking at work. And the reality is when people are synergized and working together, they're always going to work better. When you're in a positive frame of mind, I've seen the statistic, when you're in a positive frame of mind, you're 30% more effective. And so just from a purely selfish, I want to make more money standpoint, if my employees are more effective and happier with their work, if they're making more money themselves, I'm at the end of the day going to make more money myself. Oh no, by the way, with less stress because now I'm not worried about like this sort of dog eat dog, keeping on top of the pyramid approach to life.
In the longer run, let's say classic knowledge work, maybe you're a claims adjuster in the insurance space, you use your brain, your judgment. I can see that there's obviously a strong incentive for a business to say, let's download right what's in Andrew's head and put it into this LLM. And now we need a lot less Andrew. So I think the question is, what are people going to get out of this?
Yeah. I would disagree slightly. I would say that's the medium term. For sure, look at Boeing, right? They got rid of all these quality assurance experts and things like that, and look at the results. There's this thing called technical debt in coding. You're like, just, oh, crap, I need to get this code released by next week. Let me just throw some stuff in there, get it to work, and just cross my fingers. And it works. You're like, oh, okay, I guess I got away with that, right? And now you do it over and over again because you have these false deadlines coming up. And at the end of the day, it's someone else's problem. Maybe it's 5 years, 10 years down the road, but it's a problem. It's a problem that is building, and that trade-off is not truly a trade-off, right? All you're doing is you're kicking the can down the road, and unfortunately, the habit we have now is kicking the can down the road to the point where I've left, and now it's someone else's problem. And so I think smart people already realize that. Again, in this medium term, you're going to have this destruction, but I think when you move towards people at the top, the kind of people who own the businesses and owners, they realize now that hang on, with slightly more people. There's way more need for medical services than there's capacity to fill that. There's way more need for legal services than there's capacity to fill that. Way more need for accounting, right? And I'm talking about just the people who are sophisticated enough to know that I need an accountant, I need a lawyer, I need a doctor, right? Yes, I think there's going to be a transition, but again, talking about bias, right? Talking about looking at reality, right? There's a whole underserved market there of anything. I don't care what business you're in. So I think shifting the view from, to your point, that sort of myopic view of cost savings to your potential customer base, I think that's the way you start thinking about how you can really empower your staff to automate the BS and really focus on customer service.
Okay, so you sold me. Let's say I'm a middle manager somewhere. I'm not a technological person. And let's say I'm way further down in the food chain. So there's nobody knocking at my door and say, hey, we have from corporate, from the AI department, we're here to make your life better. In absence of that, and given some of the risks that exist, is there something that people can do, should be doing at this stage of the AI journey? How can leaders get ahead of this?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And I think it goes back to what I talked about at the beginning in terms of like our approach internally is not, we're the technology team, here's a tool, we'll train you how to use it. We are together, peers with you on the program, on the business side, on the staff side, discovering how to use this tool. This kind of idealized view of agile development and all that, where you have these cross-functional teams of like business people and developers coming in there. And let's face it, right? At the end of the day, agile boils down to, instead of doing a project in with a lot of deliverables in 8 months, we're going to take those deliverables and chunk them into smaller sprints. Right? At the end of the day, you're still doing waterfall. There are a lot of pompous technologists out there who think, oh yeah, don't you worry your pretty little head about that. I'm the technologist, I got it. But I think if we shift to the mentality of, yeah, I might understand the code that we're writing and like how to set up that virtual machine, but I don't understand that problem. And you and me together will be able to solve this. And so I think that taking that viewpoint as a leader in an organization, that's what I would do. I would say, let's take a step back from generative AI as a technology thing. Yes, it started in that side, but it's different than business intelligence. It's different than mobile development. It's different. Like all those are evolutionary things. Like when you're doing data analytics and data science, at the end of the day, you're just doing fancy regression. You learned that as a statistician 40 years ago. This is more and more automated and faster, but it's not different. But with generative AI, I think because it is really meeting people where they are and automating this clerk thing, automating this assistant thing, I think the ability to take information that's complex and bring it down to people's level and not leaving them there. But when you're bringing complex information down to something simple, what you're doing is giving them a rung on the ladder. And you give them that first rung. Then you give it a little bit less simple, and there's the next rung. And then you give them a little less simple, and the next rung. And soon they're scaffold their way up to something that's more sophisticated. I think that's the way you got to think about it, is generative AI and this new world that we're about to enter it's almost an evolution in education in a way, because now it's not a matter of going and taking a training course. It's a matter of engaging with your own custom tutor that is meeting you where you are. On the flip side of that, to be sure, you can feed it a lot of biased BS, right? And now it's telling people what they already believe and really reinforcing that. So by no means am I saying that this is an automatic kind of thing, but I think if we just take a frankly very pragmatic, hard-hearted view, not an emotional view of what advantage it is for us, right? It's more advantageous for us to work together than it is for us to work against each other. And that's not like a hippy-dippy kumbaya kind of thing. Let's not waste our energy bashing our heads, because we get a lot further working together. And now we have this kind of potential tool that allow us to bring people along the ride. I was always very skeptical about retraining. You talk about some manufacturing facility that disappeared in the Rust Belt somewhere, and they're trying to retrain people to do things. I'm like, that's very difficult to do. How are you going to retrain somebody who will work with their hands to do coding or any kind of technology thing? It was a little bit of a feel good kind of thing. It's, oh yeah, we're doing retraining, so it makes me as a progressive to feel better. But I'm not actually necessarily helping anybody, because that person is not necessarily going to be able to make that leap. But now, instead of making that leap being a chasm, you're giving them these rungs, right? I'm not telling you to jump 100 yards, just jump a foot, because now this system, where before a person has to bring them along, now this system can help bring them along slowly but surely in a way that kind of meets them where they are and it helps them grow a little bit more. So I think we got to stop thinking about it as a zero sum game. Pragmatism and being good to people are aligned, they're not opposing. And I think that's the kind of viewpoint we need to inculcate in leadership and in our organizations at large.
I think it's a fascinating topic because we'll see how it plays out. I'm a little pessimistic that's going to happen without some external pressure that says, here's how you have to do this. Me and now versus us in the future perspective, me and now tends to be over indexed.
I agree. I agree. But that's where I do think I am being a little Pollyannish, but not in a ridiculous way, because I do think that at the end of the day, people would rather get along than they would not. At the end of the day, we are more alike than we are different, and these divisions that we have are more artificial. And I think empowering those communities separately will give us the ability to work together, hopefully.
So artificial intelligence will overcome these artificial separations.
I think so. I think it'll help people tap into what's really good for them instead of what they're afraid of. Maybe that's a good way of putting it.
Wonderful. Listen, on that hopeful, positive note, let's end there before entering into the dystopian spiral. Andrew, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Really appreciate you sharing your own experience, putting AI to work and making it have an impact in an organization. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, I enjoyed the conversation. Yeah, thank you for having me.
We hope you enjoyed this discussion. If you did, be sure to subscribe, like, share, or comment. Until next time, let's make work matter.